the biggest strike by public sector workers in almost 30 years took place in West Virginia over the past almost 2 weeks. They resolved it earlier this week. West Virginia teachers went on strike. They were the 48th out of 50th lowest paid teachers in the country. They live in a state where there is no right for collective bargaining per se, and it's basically a right to work for less state. Their strike was technically unlawful, meaning not that they could go get arrested for striking, but that if the school districts decided to enjoin them from striking, they could have, and that would have left the union itself open to some lawsuits. But they won their strike this week after about 3 or 4 days after the union leadership had come to a deal and the rank and file had rejected it. In winning their strike, they not only got a 5% raise for themselves, they get a 5% raise for all public sector workers. And this is really important as we talk about it. They also got some concessions in terms of their health care. They basically kicked the can down the road, and there's going to be some study on that. And they're going to have the opportunity to revisit this months from now if things with the healthcare don't work out. And the irony is, of course, that public sector workers have a limited amount of rights to strike, but because they're not really part of a union in the same sense, they don't have a collective bargaining agreement per se. They can strike whenever they want in a weird way. So, but there's a lot of different stories involved in this West Virginia strike, isn't there?
Oh, there's a lot. And, let's just take, for instance, just the fact that it happened in West Virginia. I just find that so fascinating because, this is not a state that we consider to be some kind of, public employee rich sort of place where you expect, like people always talk about sort of the more elite coastal states or where you might expect to see some kind of a public employee pushback. I mean, they tried in Wisconsin, remember? I mean, just a few years ago. And that more or less, failed. And Scott Walker, the miscreant, ended up, sort of benefiting from the whole thing. So I think this came as a big surprise that it's happening in West Virginia. But I find it very interesting in that, number one, public employees are considered by so many on the right to just be public enemy number one. And I actually hear a fair number of people that you might consider to be center left kind of look at public employees as scans. Now, normally, there are two sets of public employees that are exempted from this loathing, and that is cops and firefighters, which is a very traditionally white male aspect of the public employee, unions. The teachers, on the other hand, that's actually a place where people of color, women have sort of been dominant. So in some ways, I think when I was watching these strikers down in West Virginia, I mean, there were plenty of men, of course. I mean, there's plenty of male teachers. But the fact is that there were a lot of women and a lot of people of color who were a part of this strike. And it just struck me that this was happening in West Virginia. This particular group of people, they are educated. But they're also very culturally identified. You could hear these people, they were all sort of, I've lived in West Virginia my whole life. These were not people who were like, coming in from out of state. These were locals. And it was that same kind of sense I got, that weird little, the hair on the back of my neck standing up and just going, you know what, there's something happening on a local level around this country of people who are just, they are rebelling in this case. I mean, really rebelling. And they won. And they won because they stuck together. They pushed it as hard as they could. They did not, and they were very reasonable. There was no violence. There was no ugliness about it. It was a strike, but it was, very, very civil in the way that they handled it. And they won. And it's like I'm watching this going, wow, I can't believe it. West Virginia. It just gives you a little bit of hope. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right here. There's almost sort of like there's two parallel stories going on with this. One is that we have seen, and you could probably peg it to the Chicago teachers strike. I think it was back in 2011, which was a very successful strike. And that led to increased what they call social movement unionism as opposed to managerial
Right.
Unionism. And you saw in Massachusetts, Barbara Maldioni became the head of the state teachers union there, and they fought off successfully attempts to privatize education via charters or expanded charters in Massachusetts. On one hand, you can see this as is part of that story, and on the other side of that story, we should also say that this week, teachers in Oklahoma and teachers in Arizona have cited what's going on in West Virginia as an inspiration to perhaps go on their own walkouts. In Pittsburgh, very close to West Virginia, and not within a couple hours, same media market, you saw public sector workers there able to renegotiate their contract because people were afraid of what was happening in West Virginia would be contagious in some respects. So you see this union story that is also, again, driven by women. You see the teachers and nurses, frankly, have been some of the most active unions over the past several years. They also are pushing this social movement unionism because they are more attached in many respects to the community because of the nature of their jobs. And so we saw these teachers there, they're negotiating on behalf of the other public sector workers, but they're also out there talking about fracking. They're talking about health issues for members of the community. They were serving food to kids, a lot of whom only get their free meals from schools. They were doing daycare, conscious of the implications of their strike on essentially their clients. And then the other one, as you raise, is we are living in an era of unprecedented activism by women. And maybe not unprecedented, but a renewed, let's put it that way, renewed activism by women to the extent we can measure major changes in what's going on politically. And we're still, a little bit out, and some of these things aren't as clear. But it is, we're watching women, particularly educated women, who are engaging in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. But it's all very encouraging, and we'll see where it leads. But for the moment, a good way to start off the program. We got to take a break. We'll be back with more in just a moment. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great Heather Parton.